There is a version of the Vietnam War that most people carry around in their heads, and it was built carefully, deliberately over decades by institutions that had every reason to construct it that way. It was not built from lies exactly. It was built from selections, from the facts that were chosen to be emphasized, the documents that were allowed to surface, the testimonies that were amplified, and the ones that were quietly absorbed into filing cabinets and never retrieved. The version most people know is the one where America misunderstood the war, where good intentions collided with jungle terrain and guerrilla tactics, and the cultural gap between Washington planners and Vietnamese villagers. That version is comfortable because misunderstanding implies innocence. It implies that the people making decisions were simply working with incomplete information. But the fuller record, the one assembled from declassified materials, soldier accounts, congressional testimony, journalist investigations, and the private communications of the men who ran the war, tells a different story. It tells a story not of misunderstanding, but of misrepresentation. Sustained, institutional, and in many cases, knowing misrepresentation. The war was not a tragedy of confusion. It was, in significant ways, a tragedy of clarity that was deliberately obscured. That distinction matters because it changes what you understand about how the war was fought, why it continued as long as it did, and what it did to the people inside it. When a soldier in the Mekong Delta in 1968 filed a report contradicting his commanding officer's body count figures, and that report was altered before it moved up the chain of command, that was not a failure of understanding. It was a choice. When the Pentagon received assessments from its own analysts showing that the bombing campaigns in North Vietnam were not achieving their stated objectives, and those assessments were suppressed or minimized in the briefings delivered to Congress and the press, that was not confusion. It was a decision about what information would be permitted to shape policy. The war had mechanisms, it had systems, and those systems were very good at producing the appearance of progress, while the actual situation on the ground deteriorated or stagnated or cycled endlessly through the same unresolvable patterns. This is what the 26 truths in this account are about. Not the cinematic Vietnam of helicopters and napalm and young men losing their innocence in the jungle, though all of that happened too. This is about the institutional Vietnam, the bureaucratic Vietnam, the Vietnam of memos and metrics and command pressures and career calculations and the slow erosion of accountability at every level of a war that somehow kept going long after any coherent definition of success had dissolved. Some of these truths were censored in the formal sense, classified and hidden from public view for years or decades. Others were simply never told because the institutions that would have had to tell them had no incentive to do so. Some were known in fragmented ways and never assembled into a complete picture, and some were visible in plain sight to anyone who was paying attention. But the volume of official narrative was simply louder than the evidence contradicting it. The first truth is about body counts, and it begins not with a scandal, but with a philosophy. In the early 1960s, when American military involvement in Vietnam was still framed as advisory and limited, the Defense Department under Robert McNamara began institutionalizing a particular approach to measuring military effectiveness. McNamara came from the world of systems analysis and quantitative management. He believed that any complex problem, including war, could be understood and optimized if you identified the right metrics and tracked them rigorously. This was not an unreasonable instinct for a corporate executive. It became catastrophic when applied to counterinsurgency. The central metric that emerged from this philosophy was the body count, the number of enemy dead. If you were killing more of them than they were killing you were winning. If their losses were unsustainable, they would eventually stop fighting. The logic was clean and simple, and almost entirely disconnected from the nature of the conflict it was being used to measure. The problem with body counts in Vietnam was not primarily that the numbers were fabricated, though they frequently were. The deeper problem was that even accurate body counts were measuring the wrong thing. The war in South Vietnam was not fundamentally a conventional military contest where attrition would determine the outcome. It was a political and social conflict in which the Viet Cong's ability to recruit replacements, maintain popular support, and sustain motivation was more important than any given casualty figure. American units could kill 100 Viet Cong fighters in an operation and return to find the same villages providing food, shelter, and intelligence to the movement within weeks. The body count said success. The situation said nothing had changed. But the metric was what moved up the chain of command and shaped assessments at the highest levels of government. What happened next was predictable to anyone who understood human incentives inside hierarchical institutions. Commanders whose careers depended on demonstrating effectiveness learned that the body count was the primary currency of success. Pressure flowed downward through the chain of command, and it was constant and real. Officers who reported low body counts in their areas of operation were seen as underperforming. Officers who reported high counts were promoted and rewarded. The result was systematic inflation. The specific mechanisms varied. Some units counted weapons captured or estimated enemy dead based on blood trails without confirming kills. Some counted civilian dead as enemy dead. Some counted the same bodies multiple times as different units moved through the same area. Some simply invented numbers because the pressure to produce them was stronger than any countervailing pressure toward accuracy. A Military Assistance Command Vietnam study conducted in 1968 and not released publicly for years found that body count figures were inflated by somewhere between 30 and 100%, depending on the unit and the period examined. Some individual instances were far more extreme. The second truth follows directly from the first and involves what happened to the people who tried to report accurately. The incentive structure that inflated body counts also systematically punished honesty. Officers who submitted conservative, carefully verified casualty figures found themselves at a disadvantage relative to officers who produced dramatic numbers. In formal and informal ways, the message was consistent: produce results or explain why you cannot. This created what military historians have described as a climate of institutional dishonesty that was not the product of individual moral failure, but of structural pressures so consistent and pervasive that resistance required unusual personal courage and usually came at significant professional cost. There are documented cases of junior officers who attempted to push back, who filed reports contradicting the inflated counts of their superiors, who raised concerns through proper channels about the accuracy of the data being reported. A significant number of these officers found their careers stalled or ended. The institutional message about the value of honesty was transmitted clearly and received clearly. It was just the opposite of what the public statements of military leadership claimed. Captain Colin Powell, who would later become Secretary of State, served as a military advisor in Vietnam in 1963 and returned for a second tour in 1968. In his memoir published decades later, he described the culture he encountered, a culture in which admitting that pacification was not working in a given province or that Viet Cong activity was increasing rather than decreasing was professionally dangerous. The official report said the war was being won. The men in the field knew the official reports were unreliable. The gap between those two realities was not a secret inside the military. It was simply not permitted to close. Powell's account corroborates dozens of similar accounts from officers at every level who watched the reporting system produce systematically optimistic pictures of a war that was not, by any honest assessment, going optimistically. The third truth concerns the Strategic Hamlet Program, which was one of the central counterinsurgency strategies of the early 1960s, and which was reported to Washington as one of the most promising developments of the war for years after the people running it knew it had failed. The program, developed by the South Vietnamese government with American support and funding, involved moving rural villages into fortified settlements where they could theoretically be protected from Viet Cong influence and recruitment. The logic had a certain superficial coherence. If you could separate the civilian population from the insurgency, you could eliminate the insurgency's base of support, its supply lines, its intelligence network. What the program actually produced was resentment. Vietnamese villagers were forcibly removed from land their families had farmed for generations, from the graves of their ancestors, which in Vietnamese culture carried profound spiritual and social significance, and relocated into compounds that were often inadequately supplied, poorly constructed, and more prison than sanctuary. Many villagers who had been neutral or mildly sympathetic to the South Vietnamese government before the program actively joined the Viet Cong afterward. The program was creating enemies faster than it was pacifying them. This was known. Reports from American advisors in the field documented the resentment and the recruitment effects throughout the program's operation. The British counterinsurgency expert Sir Robert Thompson, who had helped design the successful Malayan emergency strategy and was advising in Vietnam, warned repeatedly that the program was being implemented in ways that would undermine rather than advance its objectives. The South Vietnamese official statistics on strategic hamlets, which American planners were relying on, were essentially fabricated. Hamlets were reported as completed and operational when they had not been built. Hamlets were reported as secure when they were being regularly penetrated by the Viet Cong. The number of people resettled, the degree of fortification, the level of security, all of it was inflated in the reports traveling up to Saigon and from there to Washington. When the coup against South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem occurred in November 1963 and the new government began actually inspecting the hamlets, they found that a substantial fraction of those reported as functioning did not exist in any meaningful sense. The program was quietly wound down, its failure absorbed into the bureaucratic record without ever being clearly communicated to the American public as the significant setback it represented. The fourth truth is about the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and it goes considerably beyond what has entered the standard historical account. Most people are now aware that the second alleged attack on American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin on August 4, 1964, the attack that provided the pretext for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and the dramatic escalation of American involvement in the war, was at best uncertain and at worst a fabrication. What is less well understood is the degree to which this was known in real time, during the hours and days immediately following the alleged attack, by people in positions of authority who chose to proceed with escalation anyway. Secretary of Defense McNamara received communications from naval commanders on the scene expressing serious doubt about whether an attack had actually occurred, even as he was presenting the incident to Congress as an established fact requiring immediate response. The commanding officer of one of the destroyers involved, Captain John Herrick, sent a message to the Pentagon within hours of the alleged attack, saying that review of the action made many reported contacts and torpedoes fired appear doubtful, and recommending a complete evaluation before any further action. That message arrived before the congressional resolution was passed. It did not change the briefings delivered to Congress. President Johnson himself, in a private conversation recorded at the time, expressed doubt about what had happened. The famous statement attributed to him that for all he knew the American destroyers had been firing at flying fish captures something of the uncertainty that pervaded the highest levels of the administration, even as the official narrative of unprovoked aggression was being crystallized for public consumption. The decision had already been made to use the incident as a trigger for escalation. The evidence supporting that decision was a secondary concern. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which passed with only 2 dissenting votes in the Senate and none in the House, was built on a foundation that its architects knew to be uncertain. This was not discovered decades later. It was known at the time. The decision to proceed was made anyway. The fifth truth concerns the air war, and what was known and not known about its effectiveness. The bombing campaigns over North Vietnam, which varied in intensity throughout the war and included periods of dramatic escalation, were justified to the American public and to Congress on the grounds that they were degrading North Vietnam's ability to supply the insurgency in the South, and that they were imposing costs that would eventually alter Hanoi's strategic calculations. The internal assessments of these campaigns, produced by the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and McNamara's own Systems Analysis Office within the Pentagon, consistently and repeatedly found that the campaigns were not achieving these objectives. North Vietnam was an agricultural economy with limited industrial infrastructure, and the bombing was destroying targets that could be rebuilt, replaced, or simply bypassed. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the supply network running through Laos and Cambodia that was the primary resupply route for forces in the south, was not a fixed installation that could be eliminated by bombing. It was a dispersed, adaptive network of paths and trails and waterways that absorbed enormous bombing damage and continued to function. The CIA's assessments were particularly pointed. Agency analysts found that the bombing was not interdicting supplies at a meaningful level, that North Vietnam was receiving replacement material from China and the Soviet Union faster than the bombing was destroying it, and that the North Vietnamese population was responding to the bombing with increased rather than decreased commitment to the war effort. These assessments were produced, filed, circulated within intelligence and defense circles, and largely ignored in the public justifications for continuing and escalating the air campaigns. The gap between what the classified assessments were saying and what was being said publicly was not incidental. It was structural. The bombing continued because it was politically difficult to stop, because it gave the impression of action and resolve, and because admitting that it was not working would have required admitting that one of the primary instruments of American strategy was failing. So the assessments that said it was failing stayed inside the system, and the public briefings continued to describe progress. The sixth truth is about the Phoenix program, which was one of the most aggressive and least publicly discussed American operations of the war. Phoenix was a joint American and South Vietnamese program designed to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure, the political and administrative network that organized supply, recruitment, intelligence, and popular support for the insurgency. The program's logic was sound in a narrow sense. The military arm of the insurgency could not function without the political and organizational infrastructure that supported it, and targeting that infrastructure was a more strategically significant approach than simply accumulating enemy dead. In practice, the program operated with minimal oversight, contradictory mandates, and profound opportunities for abuse. Provincial reconnaissance units, the main instrument of Phoenix at the local level, were tasked with capturing, interrogating, and when capture was not feasible, killing members of the Viet Cong infrastructure. The program's official statistics claimed that between 1968 and 1972, approximately 80,000 people were neutralized through Phoenix, meaning killed, captured, or defected. Of these, roughly 20,000 were listed as killed. The truth underneath these numbers was considerably more troubling. The criteria for identifying someone as Viet Cong infrastructure were vague and locally administered. Village informants, some of whom had personal or economic grievances against their neighbors, could identify someone as a Viet Cong member without any corroborating evidence. South Vietnamese officials sometimes used Phoenix to eliminate political opponents who had no connection to the insurgency. The interrogation methods used at provincial interrogation centers, where captured suspects were taken, were routinely brutal and included torture techniques that American advisors witnessed and in some cases facilitated. American officials who tried to impose standards of evidence or constrain the program's more extreme practices found themselves working against the grain of a system that had been designed for speed and lethality, not due process. Congressional testimony from Vietnam veterans who had worked in or alongside Phoenix, given in the early 1970s, described a program that operated with almost no accountability and that killed significant numbers of people who were not combatants or even political operatives of the insurgency. The official position was that the program was effective and necessary. The people inside it described something considerably harder to defend. The seventh truth involves the relationship between the American military command and the South Vietnamese government and military, and specifically the degree to which American strategy was built on a foundation that American commanders privately acknowledged was unreliable. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN, was the primary indigenous military force that American strategy depended on to eventually assume responsibility for the war. The strategy of Vietnamization, which became the official American exit strategy under Nixon, was premised on building ARVN into a force capable of defending South Vietnam without American ground forces. This required that ARVN be a functioning, effective military organization. The private assessments of American advisors who worked with ARVN units throughout the war, assessments that circulated internally but were heavily filtered before appearing in public statements, were far less optimistic than the public narrative required. ARVN suffered from chronic leadership problems, with officer positions often allocated based on political loyalty to the Saigon government rather than military competence. Desertion rates were extraordinarily high, frequently exceeding the rate of combat casualties. Unit cohesion in many ARVN formations was poor, and the willingness of soldiers to press offensive operations against determined Viet Cong or North Vietnamese units was inconsistent. American commanders were aware of these problems. Generals Westmoreland, Abrams, and others made recommendations, expressed concerns, and pushed the South Vietnamese government to reform its military. Some improvements occurred, but the fundamental structural problems, the patronage-based officer corps, the inadequate pay that made corruption among soldiers nearly inevitable, the failure to develop genuine unit cohesion and institutional loyalty, persisted throughout the war. The official statements about ARVN capability issued for public consumption consistently overstated the situation. When the final North Vietnamese offensive came in 1975 and ARVN units collapsed with a speed that surprised even pessimistic observers, it was not because the military balance had suddenly shifted. It was because the institution that American strategy had spent a decade building had never been as strong as the public account of Vietnamization required it to be. The eighth truth is about the soldiers themselves and what happened to them inside a war whose metrics had disconnected from any meaningful reality. One of the most consequential and least discussed aspects of the Vietnam War is what the body count culture and the broader institutional dishonesty of the command structure did to ordinary American soldiers at the squad and platoon level. Young men who had enlisted or been drafted found themselves in a war where success was measured in corpses, where pressure to produce those corpses was constant and came from officers whose own careers depended on the numbers, and where the question of whether anyone being killed was actually a combatant was often deliberately not asked because the answer might complicate the count. The rules of engagement that formally governed who could be killed and under what circumstances were routinely interpreted in ways that expanded the category of legitimate target to include virtually anyone in certain areas under certain conditions. Free fire zones, areas designated as cleared of civilians where anything that moved could theoretically be engaged, created operational environments in which killing civilians became procedurally routine. This was not primarily a product of soldiers who arrived in Vietnam with violent or sadistic tendencies. It was a product of an institutional system that created enormous pressure to produce body counts and minimal pressure to ensure that those counted were actually combatants. Veterans who spoke about this in later years, in oral history projects, in testimony before the Vietnam Veterans Against the War's Winter Soldier investigation in 1971, and in personal accounts published over decades, described a gradual process of moral erosion. Not a sudden decision to abandon ethical constraints, but a slow accommodation to an environment where those constraints were structurally undermined and where the alternative, refusing to participate, carried real personal risks and accomplished little against the systemic pressure. The soldiers who came home carrying what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder were not just carrying the trauma of combat. Many were carrying the weight of having done things that the official account of the war did not acknowledge, and that American society was not prepared to hear about. The ninth truth concerns the massacre at My Lai, but it concerns specifically the institutional response that followed the massacre more than the event itself, which has entered the historical record in considerable detail. On March 16, 1968, elements of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, under the command of Lieutenant William Calley, entered the hamlet of My Lai and killed somewhere between 300 and 500 unarmed civilians, including women, children, and elderly. There were no Viet Cong present. The victims were not combatants. The killing went on for hours and included shootings, beatings, and systematic atrocity. Two facts about My Lai are less well known than the massacre itself. The first is that the incident was covered up for over a year by the Army chain of command and was only brought to public attention because of the persistent efforts of a veteran, Ron Riddenhauer, who had heard accounts from soldiers who had participated or witnessed the massacre and wrote letters to Congress and the Pentagon demanding investigation. The Army's initial response to the massacre was to file reports describing it as a successful combat operation with a high enemy body count. The covering up of My Lai was not a spontaneous individual decision by one or two officers. It involved multiple levels of the chain of command and reflected the same institutional culture that had produced the body count inflation, the suppression of accurate reporting, and the pressure toward optimistic assessments. My Lai was, in the most disturbing sense, a product of the system working as designed. The second less-known fact is the breadth of what was not prosecuted. The Army's own internal investigation, the Peers Commission, found evidence of serious crimes at My Lai and also found substantial evidence that the cover-up extended well above the level of the officers who were eventually charged. 26 soldiers were charged with crimes related to the massacre. Only one, Lieutenant Calley, was convicted, and he served 3.5 years under house arrest before being pardoned by President Nixon. The officers above Calley, whose orders created the conditions for the massacre, whose reports covered it up, and whose command culture made such an event possible, were not convicted of anything. The Peers Commission's findings about the scope of institutional responsibility were not publicly released for years. The version of My Lai that eventually entered the national consciousness was the version of an isolated aberration, a failure by a few men in a specific unit. The version buried in the Peers Commission report was something considerably larger. The 10th truth is about what happened in Cambodia and Laos, and it begins with the simple fact that the United States conducted an extensive and prolonged military campaign in two neutral countries that was systematically concealed from Congress, from the American public, and to a significant degree from most of the American military itself through falsified records and dual reporting systems. Beginning in 1969 and continuing until 1973, American B-52 bombers flew thousands of sorties against suspected North Vietnamese base areas in Cambodia under Operation Menu, a series of bombing campaigns named after meals. The existence of these operations was known to a small circle of senior officials and military commanders. It was not known to Congress, which had not authorized military operations in Cambodia, and it was not known to the American public. The falsification of records to conceal the bombing was deliberate and systematic. Crews were given false coordinates for their mission reports. Actual targets were recorded on a separate classified system, accessible only to those with specific need-to-know clearances. Regular Air Force records showed the planes bombing approved targets in South Vietnam. The classified records showed where they had actually gone. The scale of the bombing was enormous. Over the course of the campaign, American aircraft dropped more tonnage of bombs on Cambodia than had been dropped on Japan during all of World War II. The effect on Cambodian society was devastating. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed or displaced. The bombing drove peasant populations into the arms of the Khmer Rouge, the radical communist movement that would go on to implement one of the worst genocides of the 20th century after taking power in 1975. The connection between the American bombing and the rise of the Khmer Rouge is not speculative. It is documented in Khmer Rouge recruitment records, in the testimony of survivors, and in the academic work of historians including Ben Kiernan and Taylor Owen, whose analysis of declassified bombing data showed a direct correlation between heavily bombed areas and Khmer Rouge recruitment. The bombing of Cambodia was not just a violation of Cambodian sovereignty and American law. It was a strategic error of enormous consequence that was concealed from the people who might have stopped it. The 11th truth concerns the treatment of American prisoners of war and what the military and government knew and did not do about it in real time. The suffering of American prisoners held in North Vietnamese facilities, including the infamous Hoa Lo prison, known to Americans as the Hanoi Hilton, has been extensively documented and is part of the acknowledged historical record. What has received considerably less attention is the evidence suggesting that American officials had more information about prisoner treatment, prisoner numbers, and the use of prisoners as leverage in negotiations than was ever shared with the families of the missing and the American public. There is credible evidence, including signals intelligence and intelligence reports, that were not declassified for decades, suggesting that American officials negotiating the Paris Peace Accords had reason to believe the number of prisoners Hanoi acknowledged holding was lower than the number actually in captivity, and that this discrepancy was not aggressively pursued in the negotiations. The reasons for this are not fully established by the documentary record. What is established is that questions about prisoners and missing personnel were never fully resolved, and that the information available to the government was not fully shared with families or the public during or immediately after the war. The 12th truth is about Agent Orange and what Dow Chemical, Monsanto, and the military knew about its toxicity while it was being deployed. Between 1962 and 1971, American aircraft sprayed approximately 20 million gallons of herbicides over South Vietnam and adjacent areas as part of Operation Ranch Hand, intended to defoliate jungle areas and destroy crops that might supply the Viet Cong. The most widely used mixture, Agent Orange, contained dioxin as a contaminant at levels that were known to be highly toxic at the time of its production. Internal documents from Dow Chemical and other manufacturers of Agent Orange show that company scientists were aware of the serious health risks associated with dioxin exposure, including chloroquine, liver damage, and cancer, as early as the 1960s. This information was not shared with the military personnel who were mixing, loading, and applying the herbicide, or with the soldiers and civilians in the areas where it was sprayed. The long-term health consequences for American veterans who were exposed to Agent Orange, including dramatically elevated rates of certain cancers, diabetes, and neurological conditions, and for Vietnamese civilians and their descendants, including extraordinarily high rates of birth defects and developmental disorders that continue to be documented today, were entirely foreseeable from what was already known. The decision to deploy Agent Orange on the scale that it was deployed was made in the context of information that should have prompted far greater caution and in many cases was actively suppressed by the manufacturers. The 13th truth is about fragging, the practice of soldiers killing or attempting to kill their own officers, which reached levels in Vietnam that were entirely without precedent in American military history. The term derived from fragmentation grenades, which were the most common weapon used in these attacks, partly because they were readily available and partly because it was difficult to identify a specific assailant from the physical evidence they left. The Army's official statistics on fragging incidents between 1969 and 1972 showed over 600 confirmed or suspected fragging incidents, but these were only the cases that were officially acknowledged and investigated. Veterans and military historians have consistently argued that the actual number was higher, with some estimates ranging into the thousands when incidents that were handled informally, covered up at unit level, or simply recorded under other causes of death are included. The scale of fragging was known within the military at the highest levels and was understood as an indicator of a severe breakdown in unit cohesion, morale, and the fundamental relationship between officers and enlisted men. It was not communicated to the American public with anything approaching the candor the situation warranted. Public statements by military spokespeople described isolated incidents rather than a systemic pattern that reflected the profound dysfunction of a military institution under extraordinary strain. The fragging phenomenon was concentrated in the period after the Tet Offensive of 1968, When the gap between official optimism about the war's progress and the experienced reality on the ground had become impossible for many soldiers to maintain internally. It was also concentrated among draftees rather than volunteers, which reflected the deepening gulf between the institutional army and the involuntary soldiers who formed an increasing proportion of its combat strength as the war went on and voluntary enlistment declined. Officers who were seen as unnecessarily aggressive in pushing search and destroy operations, who were willing to take casualties to achieve body count objectives that everyone in the unit understood to be functionally meaningless, were the primary targets. In this sense, fragging was a market correction of sorts, the only mechanism available to soldiers at the bottom of the hierarchy to impose costs on the officers who were, in their view, spending lives for metrics. That such a mechanism became so widespread was a sign of how completely the official accountability systems had failed. The 14th truth concerns the drug epidemic within the military in Vietnam and what the command structure did and did not do about it. By the early 1970s, heroin addiction among American soldiers in Vietnam had reached epidemic proportions. A 1971 study commissioned by the Department of Defense found that approximately 15% of soldiers in Vietnam had become addicted to heroin, which was cheap, widely available, and in many areas of operation actively pushed by local networks that had discovered the American market. The scale of this crisis was known to the command structure at multiple levels. It was handled primarily as a disciplinary problem, with addicted soldiers subject to discharge and legal sanction, rather than as a public health emergency requiring medical intervention. This approach ensured that soldiers who were struggling with addiction had every incentive to conceal it rather than seek help, which exacerbated the problem and made tracking its actual scope extremely difficult. The public statements about drug use in Vietnam during this period were systematically understated, and the decision to approach addiction primarily as a moral and disciplinary failure rather than a medical reality reflected both the institutional culture of the military and the political unacceptability of the alternative narrative. That the American military in Vietnam was not merely losing a war, but experiencing a profound institutional collapse in which drug addiction, fragging, racial conflict, and widespread indiscipline had fundamentally compromised its effectiveness. The 15th truth is about racial conflict within the military in Vietnam, which was extensive, often violent, and almost entirely absent from the official account of the war during its operation. The late 1960s and early 1970s were a period of intense racial crisis in American society, and those tensions were transported directly into the military in Vietnam, where black soldiers served in disproportionate numbers in combat roles, where the disconnect between fighting for a country that treated them as second-class citizens was sharpest, and where the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1968 triggered grief, anger, and confrontations on military bases throughout Vietnam that left at least 6 soldiers dead in the immediate aftermath. The military's response to racial conflict was primarily suppressive. Commanders who reported serious racial problems were sometimes seen as admitting a failure of unit leadership. Black soldiers who raised grievances about discriminatory treatment in assignment, promotion, and military justice were frequently disciplined for insubordination. The particular anger of many black soldiers at being asked to risk their lives for a country that denied them equality was treated as a military discipline problem rather than a political and moral reality that the institution needed to engage with honestly. Congressional investigators and independent journalists who examined the racial situation within the military in Vietnam in the early 1970s found it considerably more volatile and more structurally embedded than the military's official communications had indicated. The Defense Department's own studies, including the Gesell Committee report on equal opportunity in the armed forces, documented systematic discrimination in military justice, where black soldiers received harsher punishments for equivalent offenses, in assignment to the most dangerous duties, and in the advancement system. These reports existed. They circulated within the institution. The public account of race relations in the military was shaped by different considerations than accuracy. The 16th truth concerns what has been called the credibility gap, and specifically what happened to the individual journalists and analysts who tried to close it. From the earliest years of American involvement, there were reporters in Vietnam whose accounts contradicted the official briefings. David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan of the New York Times, Peter Arnett of the Associated Press, and a handful of others reported in the early 1960s that the war was not going as well as the daily briefings at the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, which journalists had sardonically renamed the 5 o'clock follies, claimed. The Kennedy administration attempted to have Halberstam removed from Vietnam. The Johnson administration conducted sustained and at times quite aggressive campaigns to discredit reporters whose accounts did not align with the official narrative, leaking information about their personal lives, pressuring their editors, and using the apparatus of government to suggest that critical coverage was helping the enemy. This was not an incidental response to troubling journalism. It was a systematic effort to control the information environment, and it was carried out with the full awareness that the journalism being targeted was accurate. The relationship between the military command and the press in Vietnam was one of the most consequential institutional relationships of the war, and its breakdown was directly related to the systematic dishonesty of the official briefing system. Reporters who spent time in the field and saw what was actually happening, and then attended the evening briefings and heard what the command was claiming about what was happening, gradually concluded that the briefings were not just occasionally inaccurate, but systematically disconnected from reality. This conclusion, once formed and reported, could not be unformed, and no amount of access management, press credential restriction, or official pressure entirely reversed the damage. The credibility gap was not discovered by the press. It was created by the institution and then reported by the press, which is a different thing with different implications for where responsibility lies. The 17th truth is about the Tet Offensive of January 1968, which has entered history as the turning point of the war, the moment when public opinion shifted decisively against continued involvement. The standard account is that Tet was a military defeat for the Viet Cong, but a political and psychological victory, because the scale and coordination of the attacks demonstrated that official claims about the war's progress were false. Both parts of this account are accurate, but they obscure something important. The Tet Offensive was not a surprise in the sense that American and South Vietnamese intelligence services had no indication it was coming. In the weeks before the offensive, signals intelligence had picked up indicators of unusual communist movement and coordination. The CIA had been warning for months that the enemy was planning a major escalation. The military command in Saigon had been receiving fragmentary intelligence suggesting a major offensive was imminent. These warnings were processed, assessed, and substantially discounted, partly because the accepted wisdom was that the Viet Cong would not be capable of coordinated attacks in so many locations simultaneously, and partly because the intelligence picture was genuinely ambiguous. But the more consequential intelligence failure was not tactical, but strategic. The American command structure had been so completely enclosed within a narrative of progress, so thoroughly insulated by a body count and Hamlet evaluation system that reported continuous improvement, that the possibility of a major strategic offensive had become genuinely difficult to imagine from inside the official picture. The intelligence warning the command received could not be integrated into a strategic assessment that said things were going well, because the two were contradictory, and the strategic assessment had institutional priority. The Tet Offensive was not just an intelligence failure. It was the most dramatic single demonstration of what happens when an institution is organized around producing an optimistic narrative rather than an accurate one. The 18th truth is about the secret negotiations and what was done to them. In the fall of 1968, the Johnson administration was engaged in peace negotiations in Paris that appeared to be moving toward a breakthrough. The North Vietnamese had agreed to allow South Vietnam to participate in the talks in exchange for a halt to American bombing of the North, and there were grounds for cautious optimism that a negotiated settlement might be achievable. Richard Nixon's 1968 presidential campaign became aware of these negotiations through various channels. Anna Chennault, a prominent Republican fundraiser and the chair of the Republican Women for Nixon Committee, who had deep connections in South Vietnam, served as an intermediary between the Nixon campaign and the South Vietnamese government of President Nguyen Van Thieu. The message delivered through this channel was that Thieu should not join the Paris talks, that a Nixon administration would give South Vietnam a better deal than it would receive from Johnson and Humphrey. Thieu withdrew from the talks. The potential negotiated settlement collapsed. The war continued for nearly 7 more years. The evidence that this occurred is substantial and includes FBI surveillance recordings of Chennault's communications, intelligence intercepts, and the accounts of multiple participants. Johnson was furious and privately described what had happened as treason. He did not make it public because doing so would have required revealing the intelligence sources and methods used to detect it, and because the political consequences of accusing a presidential candidate of the most serious possible interference with ongoing peace negotiations were ones he was not prepared to manage. The exchange cost perhaps 20,000 additional American lives and an unknowable but enormous number of Vietnamese lives. The 19th truth involves what happened to the men who returned from Vietnam and tried to tell the truth about what they had experienced. The Winter Soldier investigation, held in Detroit in January and February of 1971, was organized by Vietnam Veterans Against the War and brought together over 100 veterans who testified about atrocities they had witnessed or participated in. The testimony was specific, detailed, corroborated across multiple witnesses, and described not isolated incidents but patterns of conduct. The routine killing of civilians in free fire zones, the torture of prisoners, the pressures that produced these behaviors, and the institutional systems that permitted and encouraged them. The mainstream American media largely ignored the Winter Soldier investigation when it occurred. The New York Times ran a brief item. The major television networks gave it minimal coverage. The veterans who testified were subsequently investigated by Army intelligence and in some cases subjected to harassment and surveillance. The official position of the military and the Nixon administration was that the testimony was exaggerated, politically motivated, or fabricated. John Kerry's subsequent testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, drawing on the Winter Soldier accounts, received substantially more coverage and became more famous, but it also became more easily characterized as political theater because Kerry was visibly positioning himself for a political future. The original testimony, from men who had no such agenda, from men who were in many cases still visibly damaged by what they were describing, received almost no serious institutional engagement. The things they were describing had happened. The institutional response was to discredit the people describing them. The 20th truth concerns the continuation of the war under Nixon and specifically the strategy of madman theory, which Nixon described to his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, in 1969. Nixon's idea was that if he could convince North Vietnamese leadership that he was irrational and unpredictable, willing to do things his predecessors had been unwilling to do, including possibly using nuclear weapons, Hanoi would make concessions to end the war. This strategy was not announced publicly. It was expressed in private communications and implemented through signals like the massive escalation of bombing in Cambodia. Whether it was ever communicated to Hanoi in the ways Nixon intended is unclear. What is clear is that it did not work. Hanoi did not make the concessions Nixon anticipated. The war continued. The bombing of Cambodia accelerated. The internal deliberations of the Nixon administration during this period, which have become increasingly accessible through declassified materials, show a pattern of strategic improvisation, magical thinking about North Vietnamese decision-making, and a persistent gap between what was being claimed publicly about the search for peace and what was actually being done. The secret bombing of Cambodia, the invasion of Cambodia in 1970, which triggered massive domestic protest, the mining of Haiphong Harbor, and the Christmas bombing of 1972 were all presented publicly as necessary and proportionate steps toward peace. The private communications of the administration describe something considerably more chaotic. The 21st truth is about what happened to the South Vietnamese allies of the United States at the end of the war, and specifically about the promises that were made to them and not kept. The Paris Peace Accords of January 1973 were presented to the American public and to the South Vietnamese government as a framework for an honorable peace. Nixon, in communications with South Vietnamese President Thieu, who was initially resistant to signing, made explicit commitments that the United States would respond with full force if North Vietnam violated the accords. These commitments were not submitted to Congress. They were not public. They were private assurances from an American president to a foreign leader about American military action. When North Vietnam began violating the accords almost immediately after they were signed, and when the North Vietnamese conventional offensive of 1975 began in earnest, the commitment to respond with force collided with the reality of a Congress that had passed the War Powers Resolution in 1973, that had dramatically cut military aid to South Vietnam, and that was entirely unwilling to authorize renewed American military intervention. The executive commitments that had been used to secure South Vietnamese cooperation with the accords were never redeemable, because they had never been grounded in the constitutional mechanisms that would have made them redeemable. The people who suffered the consequences of this gap between commitment and capability were the South Vietnamese civilians and military personnel who had organized their lives around the assumption that the United States would honor its commitments. The evacuation of April 1975 was chaotic and partial. Tens of thousands of South Vietnamese who had worked closely with American forces, intelligence services, and civilian agencies were left behind as the situation collapsed faster than anyone had planned for. Many were sent to re-education camps. Many were killed. The photographs of people climbing to helicopter landing zones on the roof of the American embassy in Saigon while the city fell became iconic images of the war's end. The scale of what those images represented, the magnitude of the abandonment, has been somewhat softened in the American historical memory by the speed with which the collapse occurred, but it was not entirely unforeseen. The possibility that American commitments might not be honored in the event of a serious North Vietnamese offensive had been a concern among South Vietnamese officials and American analysts for years before it happened. The 22nd truth concerns the psychological damage to veterans and the specific ways in which the institutional response to that damage perpetuated harm. The condition now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder was not formally recognized by the American Psychiatric Association as a diagnosis until 1980, years after the major combat involvement in Vietnam ended. The political and institutional history of that recognition matters. The Vietnam veterans who came home with severe psychological symptoms, with nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, explosive anger, difficulty maintaining relationships and employment, were largely processed through a VA system that was not equipped to understand what was wrong with them and frequently inclined to attribute their difficulties to pre-existing character flaws or inadequate adjustment to civilian life. The research that led to the PTSD diagnosis was conducted in significant part by psychiatrists and psychologists who worked directly with Vietnam veterans, many of them motivated by the scale of suffering they were witnessing. That research had to overcome institutional resistance within psychiatry and significant resistance from the military and VA, which had institutional reasons to prefer characterizations of veteran suffering that located the problem in the individual rather than in the nature of the war they had been sent to fight. The number of Vietnam veterans who died by suicide after the war exceeds the number who were killed in combat during it. That statistic, which has been confirmed by multiple academic and government studies using different methodologies, is not well known. It points to a dimension of the war's cost that was never part of the official accounting and that continues to accumulate decades after the last American helicopter lifted off from Saigon. The 23rd truth is about the ground-level experience of moral injury, which is distinct from but related to post-traumatic stress disorder, and which was not identified as a clinical concept until decades after the war. Moral injury describes the damage done to a person's sense of right and wrong when they are forced to participate in or witness acts that violate their moral framework, when they are unable to prevent harm to people they were responsible for protecting, when they are required by institutional authority to act in ways they believe to be wrong. The concept was developed partly through the work of psychiatrist Jonathan Shea, who drew on his work with Vietnam veterans and noticed that many of them were not just traumatized in the conventional sense, but were wrestling with something closer to existential crisis about what they had done and seen and been part of. The institutional army and the VA were not equipped to address moral injury and in many cases were actively hostile to the implicit criticism of the military contained in acknowledging that the war had required soldiers to do things that permanently damaged their capacity for moral self-understanding. Veterans who tried to articulate this kind of damage in the years immediately after the war were frequently told, in clinical and informal settings alike, that they were not responsible for what they had done, that they were following orders, that war was different from civilian life and should not be judged by civilian moral standards. These responses, meant to be therapeutic, often made things worse because they evaded the actual problem. The soldier who had participated in the killing of civilians did not primarily need to be told that he was not responsible. He needed to be told that what had happened was wrong, that the institutional systems that put him in that position were wrong, and that his recognition of that wrongness was not a sign of psychological dysfunction, but of moral sanity. The institutional inability to make that acknowledgement, because it would have required admitting what the war had actually asked of its soldiers, perpetuated rather than resolved the damage. The 24th truth involves the specific issue of American prisoners who may have been left behind in Southeast Asia and the political management of that question. The 1993 Senate Select Committee on POW and MIA Affairs, chaired by John Kerry and including John McCain as a key participant, examined evidence accumulated over 2 decades about American service members who might have remained alive in Vietnam and Laos after the official end of American involvement. The committee's final report is a long and nuanced document that found no compelling evidence of living American POWs still being held, but that also documented extensive evidence that the Defense Intelligence Agency had received and in some cases suppressed or mishandled intelligence reports suggesting continued captivity. The committee found that the DIA's procedures for evaluating live sighting reports were inadequate, that some reports that warranted serious investigation had not received it, and that the institutional incentive within the DIA ran toward closing cases rather than keeping them open. The report is careful and restrained in its conclusions, but what it documents between its careful qualifications is an intelligence system that was better at producing closure than at pursuing uncertain and politically inconvenient possibilities. The 25th truth is about the Vietnamese civilian death toll and the degree to which it was never seriously incorporated into the American accounting of the war. Estimates of Vietnamese civilian deaths during the American phase of the war vary considerably depending on methodology, but the most careful academic analyses, including work by statistician Charles Hirschman and colleagues using Vietnamese census data, suggest that total Vietnamese excess deaths, meaning deaths above what would have been expected without the war, were in the range of 2 to 4 million, with a substantial portion being civilians. These numbers dwarf the American military death toll of approximately 58,000, which was itself a profound national wound. The asymmetry was never acknowledged in anything approaching a proportional way in the American public discussion of the war's costs. The Vietnamese dead appeared in aggregate statistics, if they appeared at all, and almost never in the kind of individualized, humanizing coverage that American casualties received. The wall was built and became a national landmark of grief. The Vietnamese casualties have no comparable American memorial. The ethical dimension of this asymmetry is not primarily about who bears guilt for the war. It is about what a society chooses to see and what it chooses to look past, and what those choices reveal about whose deaths are understood to matter. The 26th truth is about what changed after the war ended and what did not. In 1973, in the direct aftermath of the Vietnam experience, the War Powers Resolution was passed over Nixon's veto, intended to prevent future presidents from conducting extended military operations without congressional authorization. The Freedom of Information Act was strengthened. The Church Committee investigated and documented the abuses of the CIA, the FBI, and other intelligence agencies. Pentagon Papers had already been published. There was a genuine, if limited, period of institutional self-examination and reform. What did not change was the underlying institutional culture that had produced the problems the reform period was responding to. The military's approach to metrics and reporting evolved after Vietnam, but the incentive structures that reward positive assessments and punish candid ones are features of hierarchical institutions that do not disappear because a specific war ended badly. The relationship between government and the press remained adversarial in ways that continued to privilege official narratives over independent verification. The tendency to define military success in terms of measurable outputs, airstrikes conducted, assets destroyed, enemy casualties estimated, rather than in terms of actual strategic progress toward actual strategic objectives, persisted through subsequent conflicts in ways that would have been entirely recognizable to any officer who had participated in the 5 o'clock follies in Saigon. The soldiers and Marines and airmen who served in Vietnam carried the war home inside them in ways that their country was largely unwilling to accommodate. The men who died in Vietnam are commemorated on a wall in Washington that lists 58,000 names. The men and women who survived Vietnam continued to die from it for decades afterward, in numbers that exceed the names on the wall, in ways that were quieter and more private and largely uncounted. The Vietnamese who lived and died in the areas where American operations were concentrated between 1961 and 1975 continue to live in a landscape physically altered by that war, where unexploded ordnance still kills and maims, where the dioxin contamination of Agent Orange still passes through the food chain and appears in the bodies of children born decades after the last American soldier left. The war did not end in 1975. For significant portions of the populations it touched, it continued in the form of bodies that bore its residue, and land that could not be fully reclaimed, and families that carried its particular silences forward in time. The last helicopter left Saigon on April 30th, 1975. The war had been over in any military sense for 2 years. The North Vietnamese army completed its takeover of South Vietnam in a final conventional offensive that took less than 2 months and met resistance that collapsed far more quickly than almost any official analysis had suggested it would. The institutions that had produced 20 years of assessments and briefings and strategic rationales processed the end of the war as they had processed everything else, by filing the documents, reassigning the personnel, and moving on to the next set of problems. The 58,000 names were eventually carved into a black granite wall on the National Mall. The systems that had sent them to die for objectives that were never clearly defined, measured by metrics that had no relationship to success, sustained by a reporting apparatus that was better at producing optimism than accuracy, those systems continued to operate.